June 1944, Fort Oglethorpe, Georgia. To the German women arriving, the American prison camps were paradise on earth. They had been told to expect monsters. They braced for punishment and shame. Instead, a signals helper was given soap and canned peaches. She received 3,000 calories a day, an order from the Geneva Convention. But this impossible kindness felt heavier than any cruelty they had imagined. The American guards were simply following rules, yet these rules seemed to hide a devastating secret, a truth about what was happening to their families, far from this strange paradise. When your enemy treats you with more dignity than your own leaders did, is it an act of mercy or the most devastating weapon of all? We invite you to share your city and local time in the comments. If these accounts of honor and mercy matter, please subscribe to keep them remembered. The final miles of the train journey in June of 1944 were the slowest. Inside the stifling rail car, the air was thick with the scent of unwashed bodies, stale fear, and the metallic tang of dried blood on worn uniforms. For 22-year-old Liesel Muller, a signals helper captured with her flak battery near Cherbourg, the rhythmic clatter of the wheels against the track was a drumbeat counting down to her doom. The Atlantic crossing had been a blur of sickness and lice, fueled by whispered warnings from a Reich that was now a world away. She remembered the faces of the officers in Normandy, their voices strained as they repeated the official warnings one last time before the surrender. "The Anglo-Americans will show no mercy," they had said. "They are brutes. They will enslave you, dishonor you. To be captured is to be erased." Every woman in the car carried these words in her head. They were a shield against false hope, a preparation for the inevitable violation that awaited them. They had been told to expect mobs at the train station, spitting and jeering. They had been warned of beatings and starvation in labor camps built on cruelty. Now, as the train groaned to a halt under the oppressive Georgia sun, they braced themselves. They were the enemy, and they knew how the enemy was to be treated. The heavy door slid open with a screech, and a blast of humid air filled the car. Sunlight, sharp and blinding, forced Liesel to shield her eyes. She squinted, peering out at the platform of what she would learn was Fort Oglethorpe, a U.S. Army base that once trained American women soldiers. She saw no mob. She heard no jeers. A handful of local civilians paused to look, their expressions more curious than hateful, before turning back to their business. A few American soldiers, their uniforms crisp despite the heat, stood waiting with a quiet, almost bored efficiency. There was no shouting, no shoving. An American sergeant, a man with tired eyes who looked to be near 30, simply motioned for them to get out. His voice was calm, devoid of the rage they had been promised. The silence was more unnerving than any threat. It was a silence that made no sense, a void where the expected hatred should have been. Liesel stepped onto the dusty platform, her legs unsteady, her eyes scanning for the first sign of the trap she was sure had been set. She felt a tap on her shoulder and flinched, instinctively raising an arm to protect her face. But it wasn't a blow. It was the sergeant, holding out a small, paper-wrapped object. He pointed toward a long wooden building. "Showers," he said in heavily accented German. Liesel looked down at her hand. It was a bar of soap. Soap. For a moment, she thought it was a cruel joke, a mockery of their filth. But the guard had already turned away, organizing the other women into a line. She clutched the bar, its sharp edges pressing into her palm. It felt real. It felt impossible. The walk from the station was quiet. They passed neat rows of single-story wooden barracks, painted a uniform olive drab. There were grass lawns and gravel paths. A tall fence with guard towers stood at the perimeter, a stark reminder of their status, yet inside its borders was an order that felt disturbingly peaceful. This was not the chaotic, mud-filled slave pit from the propaganda posters. This was a place of rules, of quiet discipline. When they were led into a large hall, the scent of food hit them like a physical force. It wasn't the thin, watery soup of the front lines or the stale bread of their journey. It was the rich smell of baked bread and coffee. On long tables there were platters of white bread, not the dark, coarse rye she was used to, and small pats of real butter. And then Liesel saw it, and her breath caught in her throat. In a large bowl at the center of each table was a shimmering pool of light syrup, holding glistening, impossible slices of peaches. The last time she had seen a peach was years ago, before the war had consumed everything. She thought of her brother's letters from Stalingrad before they stopped coming. He wrote of boiling horse bones for broth, of dreaming of a single potato. And here, in an enemy prison camp, was a feast. A nurse named Erica, a practical woman of 26 who had tended to the sickest on the voyage, sat down beside her. She picked up a slice of bread, her movements slow, as if she were testing a mirage. The guards did not watch them with hungry eyes. They stood by the walls, talking quietly amongst themselves. No one hurried them, no one mocked their hunger. Liesel took a slice of peach onto her plate. It was sweet, so intensely sweet that it almost hurt. The sweetness was a lie, a beautiful, terrifying lie that contradicted everything she had ever been taught to believe. The soap had been a crack in the foundation of her world. The silence at the station was a tremor. But this peach, this simple, decadent taste of a life she thought was gone forever, was the earthquake. It shattered everything. She turned to Erica, her voice barely a whisper, the words catching on a knot of confusion and a guilt so profound it felt like a physical weight in her stomach. "This cannot be true," she said, her eyes fixed on the impossible fruit. "Everything we were told, it can't all be a lie." The question hung in the warm air of the mess hall, unanswered. If this was a lie, then what was the truth? And what did that truth mean for her family, starving in a Germany that was being bombed into ruin? The days that followed fell into a routine that was both monotonous and utterly bewildering. Life inside Fort Oglethorpe was governed not by cruelty, but by a baffling set of rules that seemed designed to preserve their humanity. The German women were housed in clean barracks, given fresh linens, and subjected to a schedule that felt more like a strict boarding school than a prison camp. Each morning, Liesel would stand in line at the mess hall and receive her rations. It was a mathematical certainty, an unbreakable policy. An American medical officer, a precise man named Captain Klein, had explained it. The Geneva Convention of 1929 required that every prisoner receive the same daily caloric intake as a U.S. soldier in a base camp, 3,000 calories. For Liesel, it was the arithmetic of a different reality. She ate soft white bread while she remembered her mother's letters about sawdust mixed with flour. She ate butter while her mind pictured the greasy film on her brother's horsebone soup in Stalingrad. The canned peaches were a constant, a daily reminder of this impossible abundance. They were delicious, and they were poison. Each sweet bite was an act of survival that felt like a betrayal. Sickness, which had been a constant companion on the journey, was treated with the same startling efficiency. Erica, the nurse, watched in disbelief as Captain Klein and his staff tended to the women. They treated infected blisters, distributed medicine for dysentery, and cleaned wounds with sterile supplies. When Liesel complained of cramps, a medic handed her 2 aspirin tablets without a second thought. For a woman from a country where even basic medicines were fiercely rationed for the war effort, the luxury of an aspirin for simple pain was unimaginable. It was another small, inexplicable act of decency that chipped away at the world she knew. These were not the actions of monsters. This was the work of men following a code she had never been told existed. This humane treatment was part of a massive, organized system. By the end of 1944, there would be over 370,000 German prisoners of war held in camps across America. Their care was a matter of national policy, a demonstration of an honor the Nazis insisted their enemies lacked. While German radios screamed about American slave pits, U.S. warplanes dropped leaflets over Europe promising fair treatment to any who surrendered. For the women in Fort Oglethorpe, this promise was now their life. From behind the wire fences, they could see fragments of another world. They watched American soldiers playing baseball, a strange and complicated game of running and shouting. In the evenings they heard music. One night, the tired-eyed sergeant who had given Liesel the soap, a guard named Whitaker, sat on a crate just outside their barracks playing a harmonica. The melody was slow and sad, but it was familiar. Erica recognized it first. It was Lily Marlene, the song that had been sung by soldiers on both sides of the conflict, a shared anthem of longing for home. A few of the women began to hum along softly. For a brief moment, there were no prisoners and no guards, only people bound by the same melancholy tune. A few weeks after her arrival, Liesel was handed a piece of paper and an envelope. She was told she could write a letter home through the Red Cross. The weight of the pen in her hand felt immense. The ability to send a message, to tell her family she was alive and, impossibly, safe, was a privilege she never expected to have again. That night, lying on her clean cot, she stared at the wooden ceiling, listening to the quiet breathing of the other women. For the first time since her capture, she felt no fear. A guard walked past the barracks on his nightly patrol. "Good night, miss," he called out softly in broken German. Liesel tensed. She was sure he was mocking her, using a title of respect to highlight her disgrace. But his voice held no malice. It was just a simple human courtesy. The peace of this strange paradise was fragile. As the summer wore on, a new kind of dread began to creep into the camp. It came on thin sheets of paper, in the Red Cross bulletins posted for the prisoners to read. The bulletins listed the names of German cities that had been the targets of massive Allied bombing raids. Hamburg, Kassel, Dresden. The names were like stones dropped into a quiet pool, sending ripples of anxiety through the barracks. The women would gather around the lists, their faces pale, searching for the names of their hometowns, their streets. Liesel's family was in Hamburg. She read the reports of firestorms, and entire districts turned to rubble, and the food in her stomach turned to lead. The generous meals, once a source of disbelief, now felt like a curse. A terrible question began to haunt their days. If life here, in the heart of the enemy's country, was a paradise of peaches and aspirin, what fresh hell was unfolding for their families at home? The quiet order of the camp was no longer a comfort. It was an isolation, a terrible separation from the suffering of their people. Their safety felt dishonest, their full stomachs an unforgivable sin. The paradise had walls, and beyond them, the world they knew was burning. The music that had once floated over the fences began to sound different. The familiar melody of Lily Marlene, played on Sergeant Whitaker's harmonica, no longer felt like a shared moment of humanity. It was a reminder of a home that was vanishing, a world of memories being systematically erased by bombs. The gentle routines of the camp, once a source of comfort, now felt like an elaborate and cruel insulation from reality. The first true crack in their strange paradise came not with a shout or a blow, but with a thin piece of paper delivered by the Red Cross in the late summer of 1944. A woman named Clara, who had worked in a Hamburg telephone exchange, received a letter from her aunt in a nearby village. She read it silently, her face losing all color. Her street no longer existed. Her parents were missing, presumed dead in the firestorm. That evening in the mess hall, she sat with her tray, staring at her slice of white bread, her pat of butter, and the 2 gleaming slices of peaches in their sweet syrup. She held the tin plate in her hands, her knuckles white, as silent tears streamed down her face, splashing onto the fruit. The very food that kept her alive was now an unbearable symbol of all her family had lost. Her silent grief was contagious. The question of betrayal, once a whisper, became a consuming anguish. How could they eat while their families starved? How could they sleep under intact roofs while their loved ones huddled in cellars, listening for the scream of the next air raid siren? The guilt was a sickness that spread through the barracks faster than any fever. Some women began refusing their meals. They would go to the mess hall and simply sit, their untouched trays a quiet protest against their own survival. It was an act of solidarity with the ghosts of their burning cities. The camp authorities, bound by their own unyielding rules of humane treatment, could not allow it. Captain Klein would reason with them, explaining that starvation would solve nothing. Guards would gently but firmly insist they eat. After a few women fainted from hunger, the protest collapsed. They returned to their 3,000 calories a day, but now every meal was an act of mourning. The peaches tasted like ashes. The kindness of their captors felt like a heavy stone on their chests, pressing the air from their lungs. This strange American mercy had become its own form of torture, a constant, nagging reminder of their helplessness. The policy that governed their lives was both their shield and their cage. in stark contrast to the brutal treatment of Allied female prisoners in German hands, particularly Soviet nurses who were often assaulted or left to starve. The U.S. Kripal Army had a strict non-labor policy for female POWs. They were not sent to work on farms like many of the male German prisoners, who earned 80 cents a day in scrip for their labor. Their only duty was to maintain their own barracks. This policy, praised by Red Cross inspectors, was a source of growing resentment among American civilians. Local newspapers near the camps began to run articles questioning the fairness of it all. As American families tightened their belts, abiding by strict wartime rationing, they read stories of German prisoners receiving generous meals. The sentiment was simple and bitter. Our boys fight and die, and the enemy eats steak. The women inside Fort Oglethorpe were oblivious to this public anger. They were caught in the paradox, symbols of an American ideal of honor that their own people could never understand, and that many Americans themselves were beginning to resent. The end of the war in 1945 did not bring the relief they had dreamed of. Repatriation was slow. It was not until 1946 that Liesel and the others boarded a train, not in Georgia, but in Europe, for the final journey home. The hope that had sustained them for 2 years, the dream of family reunions and a return to normalcy, filled the train cars. But as they traveled deeper into Germany, the view from the windows became a relentless panorama of destruction. They passed through the skeletal remains of Frankfurt, a city of hollowed-out buildings and rubble-choked streets. When the train finally pulled into the ruins of Hamburg, the silence was absolute. This was not a homecoming. It was an arrival in a graveyard. The people who met them on the platform were not family, but gaunt strangers with haunted eyes. When these survivors, thin as ghosts and clothed in rags, saw the group of women stepping off the train, healthy, well-fed, their faces filled out from years of adequate nutrition, their weary expressions hardened into contempt. Whispers turned to accusations. They were spat upon, called traitors. The stories of their humane treatment of soap and peaches and medical care were not met with relief, but with rage. The term paradise camps became a curse, a brand of shame. One of the women would later write, reflecting on the bitter homecoming, "We returned with our health, yet no one believed us. Was the mercy we received ever truly safe to trust?" In the apathetic and hungry landscape of post-war Germany, survival was a story best told through suffering. The national memory was being forged in the rubble, shaped by the dominant narratives of heroic male soldiers returning from the front, stoic civilians who had endured firebombings, and the millions of traumatized survivors of Soviet captivity. In this grim tapestry of shared hardship, there was no place for the strange, gentle story of the paradise camps. To speak of American kindness was to invite scorn. To mention full meals was to confess to a betrayal of one's starving countrymen, and so the women who had been held in America fell silent. Their experiences were an uncomfortable footnote, a private memory that did not fit the public grief. Liesel Müller, like so many others, packed away her time in Georgia like a secret. She learned that her parents had survived the Hamburg raids, finding shelter in the countryside, but the emotional chasm between her experience and theirs was too vast to bridge with words. How could she explain the profound guilt of eating a peach while they scavenged for potato peels? The memory of Fort Oglethorpe became a shadow, a complicated truth she carried alone. Years later, American veterans who had served as guards in the POW camps would reflect on the paradox of their duties. Men like Sergeant Whitaker, who had fought Germans in the hedgerows of Normandy, found themselves just months later handing those same enemies soap and ensuring they received proper medical care. It was a duty that required a deep, often unspoken commitment to a code of conduct. They were following the Geneva Convention, but for many, it was more than just a rulebook. It was a matter of honor. As one former guard from a camp in Texas explained decades later, it was about who we were. We obeyed the rules, even if they didn't. That was the difference. They had seen the worst of humanity, and their response was not to mirror it, but to uphold a standard of decency, even for those who had followed a regime built on its absolute opposite. This quiet insistence on fairness was America's most perplexing weapon, a demonstration of power not through brutality, but through restraint. It was a concept so alien to the Nazi ideology that it had sown confusion and doubt among the prisoners long before the war was lost. Decades passed. The rubble of Hamburg was cleared away, replaced by new buildings and a fragile prosperity. The war became history, a collection of dates and black and white photographs. Liesel married, raised children, and grew into a grandmother, her silence about the war a quiet weight in her family's life. Then one summer afternoon, as she sat with her young granddaughter in her small garden, the little girl asked a question. She had been learning about the war in school and wanted to know what it was like. For the first time, Liesel found the words. She did not speak of the flak cannons or the fear of capture. She spoke of the silence at the train station in Georgia. She spoke of the baffling kindness of the guards, of the music on the harmonica, and of the food that had both saved and shamed her. "I learned something very important there," she told her granddaughter, her voice soft but clear. "I learned that honor is not about being cruel when you have power, it is about being fair. The Americans gave me peaches when I was their prisoner. I never forgot it." That small act of mercy, she explained, had become the moral compass for the rest of her life. It shaped how she raised her children, teaching them not the bitterness of revenge, but the quiet strength of fairness. Later that day, in her kitchen, she took a fresh, ripe peach from a bowl on the table. With a small knife, she carefully sliced it, the juice running over her fingers. She handed a piece to her granddaughter, who watched her with curious eyes. Liesel held a slice up to the light, its color as vibrant as it had been in her memory. She looked at the fruit, and for a moment, she was 22 years old again, sitting in a mess hall thousands of miles from a home she thought she would never see again, holding a gift from her enemy that she would never truly understand. "This," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "this is what saved me." The sweetness was no longer a source of guilt, but a testament to a moment of unexpected grace. Paradise, it turned out, was not a place defined by fences or guard towers. It was the moment an enemy chooses mercy, an act so profound it could echo through a lifetime, nourishing a spirit long after the hunger had gone.